I read this and it blew my mind because when I thought about it more, I thought, well, I guess that could be. But if there was a museum that was created that just housed all of the artwork that had been stolen, right? So it's the Museum of Stolen Artwork. Things have been stolen, been recovered, put into this museum. It would be the largest art museum on the planet. Isn't that crazy? 174 Rembrandts would be in there. There would be 43 Van Goghs in the Museum of Stolen Art. There'd be over 500 works from Picasso inside that museum. That is crazy. Read a story about the Scream. If you could Google the Scream, you'd probably recognize it. Oh, yeah, I've seen that painting before. It was stolen in Norway, and it was stolen in the middle of daylight, broad daylight, middle of the day. Two guys in masks broke a piece of glass, stole a painting, and left behind a note that said, "Thank you for your poor security." Isn't that right? But left a note. That painting that was behind one piece of glass that was broken and stolen was worth $75 million, right? That would go into our Museum of Stolen Artwork. So it begs the question, like, why do people put these great pieces of art, these super valuable $75 million pieces of art out where everybody can see them? Like, why not lock it up? Like, keep it in a safe. That would make sense. But the answer is pretty obvious, because that's not what art's for, right? Like, art is meant to be seen. People who love art want other people to love the art and appreciate the beauty of it, to see it and go, man, that's incredible. An artist doesn't go through and paint something which is this artistic expression of himself or herself and go, it's done. I've spent hours or days or however long on this painting, and then I'll go put it in a closet where no one can see it, right? That's what I do when I come back from painting with a twist. It goes in the trash is where it goes. But an artist, their artwork gets displayed. That it's meant to be seen, right? Well, there's nothing on the planet more valuable. Not $75 million paintings. There's nothing more valuable than Jesus and the truth that he teaches and the truth that he embodied. And if you're a follower of Jesus, and I know not everybody is, but if you're a follower of Jesus, then you have that same idea of the artwork. You understand that Jesus should be seen. Like we want him to be seen. We want people to have an experience with Jesus. We want people to meet Jesus so they can have a life-changing experience with him like we've had. That's how a follower of Jesus should respond. So a follower of Jesus they'll give a lot of money towards ministry so people can hear Jesus. And they'll give their time that they really don't have in order for people to hear Jesus. And they'll inconvenience themselves. They might move their family. They might take their rights that are rightful theirs and lay them aside so that people can know Jesus. At least they should, right? I mean, we should. If you're a follower of Jesus, even if you're not a follower of Jesus, you probably would agree. Intellectually, we would agree, yes. If Jesus is really valuable and the truth that he embodies and he taught is life-changing, then yeah, we would sacrifice money and time and convenience and rights so that other people could breathe eternally for the first time they could have heaven in their future. We would agree, but that runs into a problem. It runs into the problem with our heart. Like we intellectually agree, but all of a sudden, if I got to sacrifice something, if I got to give money, if I've got to give up time that I don't have, all of a sudden I don't know. And that truth that we believe intellectually runs headlong into conflict with our heart, which is naturally selfish. That's what the Bible teaches, actually, that we have a sin nature. That you and I, we're inclined, our natural inclination is selfishness. That our home base is called me, myself, and I. And so even for a believer, a follower of Jesus, we're spending our lives trying to walk out of selfishness and toward the selflessness that Jesus was, that God gives us this picture of. So we know people need Jesus, but we have this problem of I don't want to change. I don't want to inconvenience myself. Couldn't everybody just meet Jesus, love the church in the way that I love it? Like my family and I, we do, and we hope you do too, practice everyday rhythms. That's you'll hear more about that as we get some stuff online. We did a sermon series back in the fall where we create kind of rhythms for a discipleship plan for our homes, for ourselves personally, for our families. And so it's things that we do. We write down to go, here's how I'm going to walk with Jesus in this next year. Well, one of mine has to do with connecting relationally with my wife and my kids. So on my everyday rhythms, I have dad-daughter dates. I've got dates with my wife. I've got family days. And so it's a pretty high priority for me. And so I'll start planning things in advance, a couple of months in advance, so I can get it on the calendar. So just guys, FYI, we're in January. So you got like 6 or 7 weeks to Valentine's. So if you're booking something, that's your takeaway for today's sermon. Like, get that date night book because Valentine's is going to fill up at the restaurant you want to go to. So booking these things, planning these things. And so we're coming back from Christmas, and I'm working in the car. Amanda's driving. I'm trying to get these dates on the calendar and trying to create different ideas, trying to get some experiences so we don't just do the same thing all the time. Let's do something that we remember. So I'm looking for like, okay, what's coming to Austin? Is there, like when the rodeo comes in the spring, lots of times we go to the rodeo. So put that down for March. Girls basketball games for UT, like my girls go to that. So I kind of put that down in February, looking what's around. So I'm looking, and you know what's coming in January? Something that's like my family's never done. I don't even think they'd be interested in it, but it's kind of different. WWE SmackDown is coming to the Moody Center, right? So I throw it out there. I'm like, hey, well, what about that? Like, it's different, right? I mean, I used to watch wrestling when I was a kid. I watched it in 20 years, but I mean, it's going to be a show. It's going to be like fireworks inside and costume people flying around and people yelling at each other and throwing each other. Like, y'all want to go? Well, I've got 2 daughters and a wife. One of them is up for anything all the time. She's like, yeah, let's do it. Like, hey, you want to go watch paint dry? Sure, yeah, when are we going? The other 2, when I throw out, what about WWE SmackDown? Look at me like I'm the stupidest person on the planet. They're like, absolutely not. No way. And so we start talking, like, what do y'all want? Like, what would y'all want to do? Because I'm like, y'all make this so hard. Like, you should love WWE. Like, they don't. They're like, well, like, what about shopping? I'm like, where? And they go, like, a shopping spree to Target. We could do that for a date. I'm like, I just walk around Target while you shop. I'm like, yes. Like, have you seen grown men in Target? They just wander. We don't know what we're doing in there. Like, they're like, yeah, it'd be fun. And I'm like, eh. They said, well, I got another idea. We could go get a blowout. I didn't know what a blowout was. What's a blowout? Well, you go to a salon. It's a thing that you do with your hair that's like super expensive. And so, like, I'm thinking, like, so for the dad-daughter date, like, I'm going to go to the salon and watch you get your hair done. Yeah. It's like, I'd rather watch a blowout on I-35. I'd rather be in a blowout on I-35 than that. Like, right? I got no desire. But those aren't in my top 500 list of things to do. But guess what we're doing? We're going to do some blowouts. We're going to do some Target shopping. Because I'm going to lay down what I like for the people that I love, right? And so here's the dilemma that we have. And we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 9 here in a second. We know intellectually that people need Jesus. We know that. Here's what we also know. Research tells us that in 2010, they said that the millennial generation, shout out to you millennials, the millennial generation was the largest group of non-religious people in the history of our country, 2010. Millennials were the furthest from Jesus. There's most of them. 2018, 8 years later, new research came out. Generation Z, the ones below the millennials, are now the largest non-religious group in American history. We don't have the research for Generation Alpha because they're teenagers and elementary school kids, but guess what we're going to find out in a couple years? The Generation Alpha is now the largest group of non-religious people. So what we know is people need Jesus. We also know that we have 3 generations, like 40 and under, that know less about Jesus and fewer people know Jesus than in the history of our country. They need Jesus, but our own bent towards selfishness ends up becoming our own hurdle. Right? Because me wanting to plan dad-daughter dates at WWE SmackDown, which, by the way, one of them is going. We go, man, I want them to meet Jesus, but I just want them to worship Jesus like I worship him. I want my friends, and I want my children, and I want my grandchildren, and I want the generation that's far from God, I want them to love church. But I want them to love church like I love it. And that's the dilemma we're in, because they don't, because the world's changing. And so as we talk about vision for 2025, nothing's changed, but it's just a reminder to you, if you go to City Church, if you're looking for a church home, here's who we are, so you know if this is a place for you or not. And I say that meaning we'd love for you to be here, but we realize that we're not for everybody. We exist for the next generation. We exist for the generation that's coming behind us, for the 3 generations that don't know Jesus. And we as a church are going to leverage everything that we have and who we are in order for them to know Jesus. And what that means is church may not look like I want it to look. I may have to lay my preferences down. I may have to lay my rights down. I may have to give of my money and my resources in ways that are uncomfortable for the generation that's coming behind me, or the generations, so that they would know Jesus. And if you go, well, what about us? I'm going to be 50 this year. Maybe you're 50 or older. You go, what about us? Let me just ask you this. Is there anything, if you're 50 and above, that you wouldn't give for your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren to have their lives eternally changed by the power of God? If there's something that you want more than that, then I will respectfully say this probably isn't the place for you, because we exist for the generations behind us. Before we get to 1 Corinthians, let me just tell you this, because I just want you to understand it. This morning, scrolling kind of through some social media, saw a picture of a church. Pastor's a friend of mine, good friend of mine, great church, great pastor. I love him. He's fantastic. Took a picture of their order of worship at their church, and it had kind of all the things that were in it, and it had several hymns, and here's what the caption said. It was this morning: if you love hymns, today's your day. Now, this is what I'm about to say is not anti-hymns or anything. Like, hymns are great. But I dare say there's not very many millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha that were scrolling through and went, if I love hymns, today's my day. Today's my day! You know what they did? Scroll on through, and in the back of their mind went, irrelevant. And a generation needs Jesus, generation and generation and generation. And God has called us to be the church that stands in the gap for those generations, our kids and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren down the line, because the legacy you're going to leave. So I want you to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, because we're going to read what a guy named Paul said. So Paul is the greatest missionary there's ever been. Paul comes in the early turn of the millennial, 30, 50, 60 AD. Paul has been a Jewish Pharisee. He knows all of the Old Testament. So when you read your Bible and you read Genesis to Malachi, you read the story of God and his people Israel. That's what the Old Testament is. Here's how I'm your God, nation of Israel. And here's how you're going to be my people, and how we do life together. That's what Old Testament is. Paul knew it all. Paul also knew that the Old Testament had this thread through it that said a Messiah or a Savior was coming. We know that that's Jesus. Paul discovered that when he met the risen Jesus, who had died and been resurrected. He met the risen Jesus, and it changed his life. Then we enter the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, first 4 Gospels is what we call them. They're eyewitness stories of Jesus: birth, death, life, miracles, teaching, all of that. Then the rest of the New Testament is primarily letters written to churches about how to live that out. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 is a letter that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth to help them figure out how to be like Jesus. Here's what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19. He says, even though I am a free man with no master, I become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I too lived under the law. Even though I'm not subject to the law, I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I'm with the Gentiles, that's anybody who's not a Jew. I mean, there's Jews and everybody else, that's Gentiles. When I'm with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from the law so I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. So what Paul is saying, he's like, hey, when I'm hanging out with people who are Jewish, and I go over to their house and I'm spending time, I'm eating dinner with them, and they have ceremonial ways to wash their hands. That's a part of their Jewish culture, a part of their Jewish law. I do it all. Like, I know that I don't have to wash my hands that way anymore because it's not about cleanliness and unclean. I've been saved by Jesus, and Jesus has made me clean. But if I'm hanging out with my Jewish friends who don't know Jesus, I'm not going to come into their home and be like, when they're like, hey, we wash ceremonially, to go, oh, you guys are dumb. You don't have to do that anymore. That's stupid. Why are you washing your hands like that? Jesus means you don't have to. He says, even though I don't have to, it doesn't hurt anything for me to do it. Because I'm trying to connect with them and reach them, and I want to love them well. So I do what they do. When I'm hanging out with my non-Jews friends, and they don't wash their hands at all, I don't wash my hands at all. I'm connecting with them. Now he says, but I follow the law of Christ. So here's what he's not saying. So don't want us to get confused. He's not saying, when I hang out with my church friends, I do church stuff. And with my friends who, like teenagers, like y'all know some of this, like when my friends who smoke a little weed on the weekends, I'll go smoke some weed with them to tell them about Jesus. He's saying, no, I follow the law of Christ. I'm not walking away from Jesus, but you know what? I might listen to some of the music they listen to. I might hang out. If they go to the movies, I'm going to go to the movies with them. I got these people that love to go bowling. I'm going to go bowling with them. I'm going to connect with the people around me and do everything short of sinning in order for them to know Jesus. I'm going to become like them. If you ask a Chinese Christian today, this is what I've heard, have not been there, but if you ask a Chinese Christian today, hey, tell us about a European that's famous from history, that they'll tell you about Matteo Ricci, is what they say. He was a 16th century Jesuit scholar, lived in Italy, but God gave him a heart for people in China. Now, this is 1582. So you don't just jump on American Airlines and head from Rome to Shanghai. Like you have to literally take a year or so to get from Italy to China. But he goes, and along the way, he learns Chinese. When he gets there, he's not even allowed into the country because China would not let Europeans in until he got some official approval. He finally gets official approval, goes in, has learned Chinese, dresses like a Buddhist monk so that he fits in, and comes kind of saying, hey, I just want to learn wisdom from you and trade wisdom. Moves into the little city, town, whatever. He moves in, finds out that they don't like Buddhist monks, and the Chinese he learns not their dialect, right? That didn't dissuade him. He begins to learn their language and their dialect, gets rid of the Buddhist monk garb, begins to dress like them, connect with them, and just be one of them. Not sinning in ways that they might sin, not that they were inherently had sin, but not that, but just I'm going to connect with you. He actually had a meeting with the emperor and gave the emperor a clock and a harpsichord that came from Italy and got favor with the emperor and became somebody. The emperor's like, I like this guy. So now he's got connections with other people. And as he lives there, he ends up translating some of the New Testament into Chinese. And then writes a book that becomes an influential book all throughout China about Jesus. But he wrote it in the Neo-Confucianism way of people's writing of that day. He wrote it in the way that they read so they could understand who Jesus was. He didn't change the truth. He didn't change the gospel. He just changed the way it was presented so that people could understand it. That's what Paul is saying here. Like, I'll become like a Jew to the Jew. I'll become like a Gentile to the Gentile because I want them to know Jesus. Look what he says in verse 22. He says, when I'm with those who are weak, which, just side note, none of us want to be weak. None of us are like, do you want to be on the strong team or do you want to be on the weak team? I'm going to hang out with the weak people and the losers. None of us. Like, we don't want to be weak. Paul says, when I'm with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. Paul, previous to this, in this chapter, he's talking about rights. And I've got the right to this, and I've got the right to that, and this is what I've earned, and I deserve that. But what Paul says through this chapter is I'm going to lay all of those things down. What I'm owed, what's deserved, I'm going to lay it down, because if my rights create a hurdle for someone to come to know Jesus, then I don't want my rights. If my preferences about worship, my preferences about church keep someone from knowing Jesus, then I'm going to change my preferences. When I was a kid, like elementary school, lived in a day, grew up going to a Southern Baptist church, and man, on Sunday mornings, like this family rules, we wore slacks like 9-year-old in slacks, like with a crease right down the middle of the legs, looking sharp, white, button-up shirt tucked in, had a clip-on tie. If I wore the black clip-on tie, just like a little Mormon kid, clip-on tie. And I had those shoes. Some of y'all remember them. They looked like leather, but I think they were plastic. And if you tied them too tight, they cut almost cut your feet off. And that's what we did on Sunday at church. And I remember as a 9-year-old, 8-year-old, like why? Look, my mom, why do we have to hate ourselves? Why do we have to wear this? And this is what my mom said. Because when we go to worship God, we come with our very best. And we dress up with our very best to go worship a God who is the very best. You know what's wrong with that line of thinking? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, I love that. I love it. Like that. Now, we have to be careful that I'm not in my suit and tie because I look really good in my suit and tie, and I got my new $200 leather shoes so I can show everybody at church. And we're all dressing up in the fashion show. That can happen. But in the purity of I want to bring my very best to the Lord, and I'm going to wear my very best in, high five. Love that. But we also have to think about other people, right? Now, if we're a church who exists for discipleship of believers, which there are some, that's not a bad thing. There are some churches, their priority is discipling believers and sending them out, fantastic. You might do things different. But if you're a church that says, hey, we're going to hand the keys to the next generation so they can lead a church that unchurched people want to come to. That's our vision. If we're going to do that, then we think through things differently. And if you're talking to your friend in your flip-flops and sandals, or sandals, flip-flops and sandals, same thing, in your shorts and flip-flops, and you're in your driveway and they're in their shorts and flip-flops, you go, hey, you got to come to church, come check out City Church with me. And they go, okay. And they show up in their shorts and flip-flops and you're in a suit and tie, we might have a problem, right? Like all of a sudden they're like, ooh, maybe I don't fit here. Maybe this isn't my place. Now, if you're talking to your friend and you go, I know this friend, they would wear a suit and tie to church. You probably ought to show up in a suit and tie. So they feel comfortable, so they connect. But we're going to reach a generation in the way that they hear what needs to be taught. We package the gospel in a way that they understand. We create an experience on a Sunday morning where the next generations who are so far from Jesus can come in and at least go, hey, I think I can come back. Hey, that wasn't too bad. Hey, that wasn't too crazy. So there's things that we don't do in church that other churches do. Not because it's right or wrong, but because we're on vision for the generations that are coming behind us, because we exist for the generations behind us. Paul does that in all of his teachings. When Paul talks to Gentiles, he talks one way. When he talks to Jews, he talks to them different. He packages the gospel for them. On Friday mornings during the football season, when I get to talk to our football guys at one of our schools, we talk about things that are faith-based. But I don't walk into the public school when I'm talking to them for a pre-football talk and go, all right, guys, turn to Judges chapter 19. I don't do that. I talk to them different than I talk to you. If you and I were in a deep Bible study with all believers, I talk differently to that group of believers in a deep Bible study than I would to you on a Sunday morning. Because the gospel doesn't change, but the context and how it's presented does. And the things that church do in order to reach people has to be adaptable. It has to be able to change to reach people. And here's the reason why is for people to know Jesus. But look at what Paul says next in verse 23. He says, I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessing. I do everything to share the good news. We exist for the next generation. But look at this. And to share in the blessing. There is nothing that is more powerful in your life than to be a part of the work of God to change someone else's. Like we all get to choose if we're a stumbling block or a stepping stone. Like same thing, but we get to choose. Are we going to be a person? Am I going to live a life? And am I going to be a church that is a stepping stone for people to get closer to Jesus? Or am I going to let my preferences and my desires and my rights and the way that I want to do things and the things that I need become a stumbling block to someone else? We get to choose if we're a stepping stone or stumbling block. And when you're a stepping stone, you share in the blessing. Several years ago, I did this Disciple Now which is like a youth ministry type of, I don't know how to describe it, retreat, but you stay at homes in people's churches. And I was the speaker. So I go to Graham, Texas, if you know where Graham is, little small town. And so I'm talking to teenagers, kind of Friday night, Saturday morning, Saturday night, and then going to close out on Sunday, and just preaching and doing things. And they're doing worship, and they're doing games, and they're doing service projects all throughout the weekend. Well, I'm in the midst of this, and I've done a couple of messages, and I've got one left. And the kids are all like eating dinner, doing stuff, and after dinner is going to be the worship service. And so I don't usually, if I'm doing something like that, I don't usually eat right before I'm going to speak. So they're all eating, and I'm over in the church worship center. Actually, I'm worshiping in the hallway next to it. And I'm just in the hallway. I'm walking back and forth. I'm praying through the message, thinking through, like, how do I want to communicate this? And so I'm just kind of pacing back and forth. And I meet a guy named Mondo. Mondo comes back. Mondo was the sound guy. They had a band. And they hired a sound guy to come and run all the stuff, my mic, the band, and all of that. And Mondo starts talking to me. He goes, hey, you got a second? I said, yeah, it's just me and him in the hallway. Everybody else is at dinner. And he goes, yeah, man, I'm not a church person. I'm not even interested in church, or haven't been at least. He said, in fact, if I had been here, I probably would have hung out for the music. But when you started preaching, I'd have left. No offense, that's not my thing. He said, but the crazy thing is, because I'm in charge of the sound, I couldn't leave. I had to be here because I got to manage your mic and make sure something doesn't happen. And he said, so, I sat through the 3 messages already, and he said, I think God's doing something in my life. He said, in fact, the last message, at the end of that message, you gave that time and you prayed a prayer and gave students an opportunity to ask Jesus to come into their life. And he said, I was sitting behind you in the sound booth and I prayed that prayer and I asked Jesus to change me and save my life. And I'm like, this is crazy. The story, I'm not even talking, the sound booth of this place is behind me. He's just looking at my better side, the whole time, and meets Jesus, meets me in the hallway, tells me about it. So here's the crazy thing. It's just how God works. So I said, well, hey man, I'm so excited for you. Kind of talk about first steps. I said, hey, baptism's something you need to do, but you also need to find a church. I said, this would be a great church. If you're here, you got to come find this church. And he goes, no, I'm not from Graham. He goes, I'm in a little town about, 45 minutes, something like that, hour away. And I go, oh, where do you live? And he goes, I live in Olney, Texas. I know nothing about Olney, Texas, except for one thing. The pastor at First Baptist Olney. I said, hey, do you know Pastor Chad at First Baptist? He goes, yeah, I know Pastor Chad. He's a great guy. I said, I'm going to call him right now and tell him that you're going to be there on Sunday. You need to be at that church. And he's like, I'm in. That was 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, I don't know. On a regular basis on social media, Mondo comes up and I'll see a thing where he posts about something that Pastor Chad talked about at church that Sunday. He'll post about what God's doing in his life. And every time I see one of those posts, it's a reminder to that day where I got to share in God's blessing. That his life has changed because God used me to be a stepping stone rather than a stumbling block. That's why we exist, right? That's why we exist. So, what do we do? It's not a change of vision. And next week we start a real series. I just want to kick off January with, hey, here's who we are. To remind us that are at City Church, hey, here's who we are and that we exist for the next generation. So what does that mean? Here's our next steps. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do, because maybe some of us need to do this. Would you just examine your views on things? That's number one. If you grew up in church, there's probably some things that we do that you don't like. They're not comfortable to you. There might be some things we do that you wish you did. But if you have a church background, we're probably a little bit different than what you're used to. There's a lot of things that are still the same. But here's what I'd ask you to do. If you find yourself going, well, why don't we do this? And I wish we did this. Or the music's too loud. Maybe it is, and we can change those things. But it's going to be louder than it is some other place. Look at those things that you might go, I just don't know if I like that. And here's what you need to ask as you examine the views. Is it biblical or is it preference? If it's biblical, I'd love to know, because we want to be biblical. But if it's preference, then you need to ask, is my preference not being met because I'm not thinking about the next generations? Maybe. And here's what I tell you. And I hope this doesn't come as, I'm not saying this to be rude or anything like that. If God says to you, hey, there's something else for you, like you're not, I haven't wired you to give your life for the next generations, there's great churches around. other ones, check them out. Like I said, that we're not in competition for other churches. We're not trying to be the biggest church in Williamson County. We're trying to be the church that exists for the next generation. And if there's 30 of us that exist for the next generation, great. If there's 3,000, fantastic. But it's not about growing a big church. It's about reaching 3 generations of people who don't know Jesus. So examine your views. Hey, why is this biblical or is it preference? I had a professor in seminary. This blows me away. He actually was like a professor. I don't know if he was like a doctor of worship. He taught in the worship. I don't even know what kind of doctorate you get, but he taught in the worship wing of the seminary. Had his doctorate, brilliant guy. And I remember sitting in a class and he's talking about responsive reading. If you're like old church, you know responsive reading, right? If you're like younger people are like, I don't even know what that means. What it was is the pastor, the worship pastor would get up. It was usually in a hymnal, and they would read a couple sentences, and then the whole congregation would stand and in unison together read the next 3 sentences. And then like if it was me, I'd read the next one, and then you guys would all read together, trying to stay on track with each other. 2 more, and we'd do this back. I would read, and you would respond in reading. Let me just tell you, we ain't never doing that. Like, it's not bad. It's actually an incredible way for some people to worship. We don't do that because we exist for the next generation. And when these students bring a friend from their school into church, or 20-somethings bring someone, and I'm like, everybody stand. Now you read these words back, they're going to be like, this feels like a cult. That's going to be the thing. Like, I'm first and last Sunday, right? So we don't do that. Stepping stone, not stumbling block. Right? But here's what the professor said. He said, if your church doesn't do responsive reading, then your church doesn't worship. I was like 24 years old, and I was like, that can't be right. Like, I know you're a doctor in Jesus, but I'm pretty sure I haven't found responsive reading in here. I mean, I know that in the Psalms, they did some responsive reading. The Jews did. Like, so it's there, but like, it's not a must. It's preference. It's a way to worship. And some churches do it and do it well as they should. We don't, because our vision is different. So if you go, hey, I love those type of things, okay, so preference is biblical. Now, if you grew up not going to church, you've got some views of what church should be like too, right? So the question for you is it biblical or is it cultural? I think church should be this, or I think we should do that. Why? Is it because the Bible teaches it, or culture has taught you that? Is it because you read something in Acts, the book of Acts, or the book of John, we should do that, or you saw it on TikTok, right? It's different. If you're not church, is it biblical or is it cultural? Examine your views and see where you land. Here's the next step. Ask everyone to consider this. Just praying. Would you just pray? Here we are in January. Would you just pray that God would bring someone into your life in 2025 that you could invest in? If you're 70, if you're 90, listen, you don't have to come hang out with teenagers. You don't have to go to Southwestern and hang out with us when we do FCA college stuff. If you're in your 70s, there might be somebody in their 50s that you can invest in. That's the next generation. You're handing the key off to somebody that's going to be here probably after you're not, right? If you're in your 70s, 90s, 50s, pray for teenagers, pray for young adults. If you can invest with kids, do. Invest with your time when you can. Invest with your money when you can. Invest in the next generation, but it doesn't have to be just kids and teenagers and young adults. It might be somebody just 10 years younger than you. But is there somebody, that's all I'm asking you, is just ask God. God, is there somebody this year that you're placing in my circle of influence for me to invest in? That's not that hard. Examine your views and pray, God, is there somebody? Because here's what just may happen. I had a guy. His name's Jimmy Myers. Some of you met him. He's actually been on the stage and preached for me before. When I was a teenager, he was an adult who invested in me. I got a lot of adults like that. I got one guy, his wife, husband and wife, David and Brenda Jernigan. I looked them up once Facebook started happening, and they live in North Carolina. They were my 10th grade Sunday school teachers. Best Sunday school teachers I ever had. Like part of literally changing my life. I found them on Facebook and sent them a message. 95% confident they had no clue who I was. Like legit. Man, they changed my life. Jimmy was the guy that changed my life. Just investing in me. 16 years old, I was 14, started getting serious about my walk with Jesus. And when I was 16, I was going to a thing we called Monday Night Bible Study. It was because it was a Bible study on Monday night. It was in the title. And we were going through the book of Galatians verse by verse. And I'm pretty much a new believer at the time. And we just he would just take us through. We'd read Galatians chapter 1, and he would talk about it, and I'm taking notes. And then one Monday, he says, hey, I'm not going to be here next week. We just finished Galatians chapter 2, verse 15. So you're in charge next week. You take Galatians chapter 2, verse 16, and just tell me where you stop. I was like, we're going to stop at the end of Galatians because all I'm going to do is read this. I don't know what to do. I'm going to read it all the way through. And he said, you're going to be fine. Like, you can study some stuff. Just ask the Lord to show you what it is. And so I came in not having a clue, trying to teach Galatians chapter 2, 16, whatever verses to my peers. Next year, God had called me into ministry, and he's pouring into me. He says, hey, on a Sunday night, a couple weeks, you're going to preach the Sunday night service at church. And I was like, nah, probably not. Hard pass. And he's like, no, you're up. You're going to preach that sermon. It was the first sermon I ever preached. Terrible. Then he hired me years later. I was an associate youth pastor under him as the youth pastor. And he kept pouring into me. Not just my life and my spiritual walk, but just like ministry skills. Like, I'll never forget him telling me, hey, in the summers we do Totally Tuesday. Every Tuesday you need to plan something. You're going to take junior hires out and do something. And he starts telling me about some things they've done in the past. He tells me about the guy who had been the intern before they hired me the last summer. And he said, yeah, for example, they went to the mall. They did a mall scavenger hunt. This was in Austin, the Barton Creek Mall. And he said, the guy before you told all the kids, like, hey, be back at the vans by 5 o'clock because we got to go home. And he said some kids didn't show up at 5 o'clock, so he just left. Got back to the church parking lot, and there were parents there, and they're like, where are our kids? And his response was, I told them to be at the vans at 5, so they're still at Barton Creek Mall. And he looked at me and said, don't do that. Check, got that? I just pouring into my life, ministry skills to life. And even to this day, he's the guy that I can call and do to say, hey, can we go grab lunch and talk? Because he's still investing in my life, right? 30 years ago, and now his investment, I get to be a youth pastor for 20 some odd years, a pastor now. My influence in people's life is because of his influence in mine. So who is it that God is going to put into your sphere of influence in 2025? That's of a generation below you that you're going to invest in, that they might literally be the next world changer. Start praying, God, show me who that is. And I'll just close with this. I hope as we move into 2025, you're excited about what God's called us to do as a church that exists for the generations behind us. I'll tell you this, we start a series next week called The Questions That Shape Us. Who am I? Where do I fit? What's my purpose? You might be a believer, a follower of Jesus for 50 years. I think those messages are going to impact you. But you know what I do know for sure? There's millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha that right now, not consciously, but subconsciously, are asking those three big questions because they shape their life. And you might bring one with you next week. And who knows, as you start investing in that person, that God might use you to disciple them to change their life. It might be your kid. It might be a grandkid. I don't know who it'd be. You just pray and ask God who it is. Let's pray now. Maybe you came in this morning, maybe you're next generation. Maybe you're a millennial or Gen Z or Gen Alpha. Maybe you walked in being a part of the statistic. Maybe you consider yourself non-religious. But God's been doing something in your life, and lo and behold, you show up here, and the Spirit of God right now is saying something to you, and you know it. He's probably calling you into relationship with Him. Because see, you were created. You were created for a relationship with God. That's why you were made. Because He loves you. And you were created actually to spend eternity with God. But somewhere along the way, probably when you were 2 years old and many times since, just like me, you've sinned. What that means is you did something that's contrary to the character of God, and it broke fellowship with you and God, because God is perfect and holy, and your decisions and my decisions have made us less than perfect and less than holy. And an unperfect and unholy person isn't going to spend eternity in the presence of a perfect and holy God, because if we do, his presence becomes no longer perfect and holy. So we have a problem. Our own brokenness separates us from God. And there's bad news. There's nothing you can do to fix it, because you can't go back in time. It's done. You sinned, as did I. But God loves you so much that he took the form of Jesus, came, lived a perfect life, and chose willingly to go to the cross and to be crucified and to die so that his blood could be shed and be your ticket into relationship with him. So that his blood would be what was shed for your forgiveness. He would pay the cost so you don't have to, because he loves you. He actually said it. Jesus said, greater love has no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friends, and you're my friend. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is just say, Jesus, I'm in. I accept it. I'm in. So if you want to follow Jesus, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Again, there's no magic in the words. It's just about your heart. But would you just agree with God that you're a sinner? Just, yes, God, I admit I'm broken. And would you just agree that, yes, God, I believe that you are Jesus and that you died on the cross, that you paid the penalty for my sin. God, I believe that. And I say, Jesus, would you be boss of my life? Would you be Lord? Would you take the keys? If you prayed that prayer, here's your next step. It's real simple. I'm not going to have you walk down front. I'm not going to have you raise your hand. I'm going to do very little to put you in a place where you might be embarrassed, because I don't want to be a stumbling block. But here's what you've got to do. You've got to take that half sheet of paper that was handed to you when you walked in from our greeters, and there's a picture of a phone on it, and there's a phone number at the top of that phone. You just text the word Jesus to that phone number. Type the phone number in your phone like you're going to text it, and just in the message, just type Jesus and send it. And then we'll get together, text, phone call, we'll meet for coffee, whatever you want. At your level of how you want to connect. We'll connect to talk about your next steps with Jesus and what it means to be a part of the family of God. If you are a follower of Jesus already, you ready to lay down preferences? You ready to lay down rights for your neighbor, for your coworker, for your kids, grandkids to know Jesus? You willing to start praying, God, show me that person that I'm going to invest in 2025. There's a generation below me, because I want to share in the blessing of you doing a work in their life. Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to kick off a new year, kind of resetting who we are, where we're going. Lord, I pray that you would take this text from 1 Corinthians, that it would be inspiring to your people. And Lord, I just pray for people who are looking for a church home, that they hear that passage and see that's who we are, and maybe they go, I'm all in. Or maybe it's clarity to go, I need to find a church that meets what God's doing in my life right now. And we just thank you that we're not in competition for people. We're in competition with the enemy for souls, for people's eternity. Lord, I pray that you'd empower us to win those battles. As in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Let's stand and sing.